uh, to be here, and thank you for having me. I believe you saw me speak at the Omaha user group, if I remember correctly. So good group of folks over there, but very happy to be here. Very happy to talk to you today about the Azure Front Door service and kind of what I'm seeing out there in the space, interacting with both clients that I work with as well as fellow users from that nature. So a little intro. Oh, there we go. So specifically, we're focusing in on critical applications, and the reason why I say critical applications is more often than not, we're seeing organizations start to kind of pull back the I don't want to say the shackles, but pull back the restraints on critical applications being left in an on-prem environment. And even if they are still in an on-prem environment, there are ways to leverage protections that are cloud native and cloud friendly, even for those applications that, for whatever reason, we can't take them from an on-prem service. So whether they live in the cloud, they live in a different cloud, they live on-prem, we're going to talk about how we can secure these critical applications with our Azure Front Door service. Now, the main premise behind this is really around SRE. And obviously, Google originally coined the term site reliability engineering. And I think initially, as I think with most things, people kind of scratched their heads and they looked at it and they're like, well, we have HA, we have DR, like that. We don't need this term, we don't need this buzzword. And so, really, in true cloud fashion, whoever tends to invent these new processes or these new paradigms tends to be the only person actually operating in them for a little while. And then what happens is people leave that organization and they go out and they either start up their own company or they go join new ventures and they're like, hey, we were doing this cool thing over here. Why don't we try it here? And right, and it just kind of becomes this kind of spider web of a thing, and it builds that momentum and eventually becomes mainstream from a cloud practice perspective. So what we've started to see out there in the last, I don't know, probably a year and a half, probably even less than that, is that SRE really is growing. And I think the ultimate reason behind that is we know that at any given point in time, there could be challenges around getting our application to have access. There are, attack vectors coming at us from all over the place. Certainly, the cloud has opened that up even larger. But even beyond that, there's just so much that's out there in the web today, and we're not even talking about either Web 2.0 or even Web 3.0. We'll just talk about the traditional web itself. But as we put more and more out there, we're accessing more and more on our mobile phones, and we're mobile. We've been at home for the most part for the better half of the last 2 years, and we've needed things to be delivered to us in a very consumable fashion. So companies have really had to shift their application architectures, especially their critical ones, into a more reliable and web friendly format. And so we've seen a lot of organizations finally start to ditch the monolithic architecture model and start to decouple these. And so as they've started to do this, they've really needed that structure around how do we focus in on the overall infrastructure to support this new microservice environment? What type of tooling do we need? And where are those people to best help us implement this going forward? So we saw this huge uptick probably about 18 months ago of companies looking for SRE, right? Whether they knew things around CI/CD or incident response or observability, things of that nature, right? SREs became a very hot item within the labor market. And I think if you were to try and go out there today and try to find an SRE, if you're not offering them, north of $300,000 a year, I'm not sure you're going to lure one away. So they are very in demand right now. And the reason is because of this wave of SRE. We've seen companies start to adopt the Netflix testing model, right? You're seeing Azure even come out with a service specifically around chaos engineering and chaos testing to make sure the applications are resilient and have that automated resiliency capability built in. By the way, that Azure Chaos Studio is in public preview, but cool service to go check out, and I'll drop the link in the chat after this is over. But ultimately, the whole premise behind this is with this explosion of applications, right? And we've seen huge adoption of these practices, specifically around some of those key areas, right? Application delivery, incident response, monitoring, observability, and even things like pre-mortems and post-mortems, and how do we take those introspectives. Those are being adopted at a very high rate. And it's becoming even more mainstream. A recent study conducted showed that within the next 12 to 24 months, right, the next 1 to 2 years, roughly 80% or probably a little bit over than that of organizations plan on either maturing their SRE practices if they've already started them, or to start adopting them, right? 80%, that's huge. All right, think of all the large organizations, even probably medium-sized organizations throughout the world, right? 80% of them are going to start adopting these practices. And so that's going to be a huge demand and uptick in people who are very skilled in things like application delivery, SRE, overall engineering, DevOps, DevSecOps, things of that nature. So the amount of, I think, wave of work from a cloud native perspective is just going to keep building. And ultimately, what's driving some of these adoptions are things around the desire to have some very, I think, what we would consider basic things. But I think as we've all interacted in the cloud world, it is a challenge at times. How do we get better monitoring and alerting, right? We do our best to monitor and alert what we can, but I think from a overall operations perspective, it takes effort, takes time to set all of that up. You need to make sure you're understanding what you need to monitor and what you want to be alerted back to you. And without interactions from, the product owners and the devs, right? It's really hard to, I think, everybody to kind of agree upon what are the things to make sure that you should be monitoring and alerting on from an overall application perspective. And I think that also speaks to keeping all of the stakeholders, right? Product, ops, devs, and business all on the same page, because more often than not, those four groups are a tree branch, right? They're all splitting off and going in some direction, and they're not all kind of going along the same path at times. And so that can be a real challenge. And so organizations are starting to recognize, hey, I need to start bringing all of these groups together and really have a clear, focused mission for each of these stakeholders, right? And we're seeing companies start to adopt better DevOps practices around that, having what's known as this cloud center of excellence, and kind of having a single voice that's kind of keeping all of these together. Everybody's on the same page and they're all driving towards the same goal. And I think once we can align the business and all of the various groups into that, then how do we measure the overall user happiness? And what I mean by user happiness is our end user, whether it's a client or our own internal employees, happy with the application? How many times have you yourself walked around your company way back in the day, it feels like, and been like, oh, yeah, this application crashed again, got to do this, got to do that. I personally was just traveling 2 weeks ago, flying out to for work, and was at the check-in counter before I had to board my plane, and the application for onboarding everybody and checking them in, crashed the ticket counter's machine, and so they had to reboot it, right? And their happiness was not very happy on top of having a huge long line of people, right? So how are we measuring that? How do we delivering better end user happiness so that when they're happy and they're like, yes, everything is working, this is moving at a pace that I expect it to, or the pace of how I perform my job, right? Then I can exude that same happiness to those around me, right? There's a lot of studies about that sort of infectious happiness, right? If you've got a bunch of happy clients or happy end users within your organization, right, it kind of spreads and kind of uplifts the whole group or your whole client base from that stance. So how do we measure that? And there's a key ways to do that from an SRE perspective, but we'll talk about how we fit that into our particular use case. How do we improve prioritization of work, right? We need to understand the service health, right? So as I'm looking at my application and the various services that I'm talking to, do I have a way to look at that service health and prioritize the work to improve the different aspects of my application? We see automating toil. So how do we work through our backlog? How do we simplify our complexity from a microservice perspective? And then how do we avoid financial penalties of breaching SLAs that we've set to our customers, our end users, right? If I'm operating an application, right, I'm sure I have some type of service level agreement that my application will be up and running for a certain period of time. So how are we working with our infrastructure? How do we work with a service from the cloud providers to help make sure that we're maintaining those SLAs and avoiding those financial penalties? Now, the funny thing is about of all of these drivers that we see, right, and there's 7 of them, most of the teams plan on measuring their service level objectives with 3 main types. And hopefully this doesn't come as a surprise. If it does, we can talk about it. User-facing services, right? So basically our user-facing applications, our APIs, and compute platforms. So container orchestration, Kubernetes, infrastructure as a service, VMs. So hopefully none of those come as a surprise to you, right? Basically everything that we have our applications, our workloads, our services running on are the 3 main service types that most organizations plan on measuring. So how does this fit into Azure Front Door? How does Azure Front Door help solve some of my SRE challenges? And it helps to kind of look at this decision tree that Microsoft put together about all of the different load balancing services. And the reason is SRE ultimately is a reliability model. So as organizations decide to make their applications more reliable, more available, I'm probably placing my application in different regions. I'm maybe placing them in different clouds. I'm placing them on-prem, so that if one region or one cloud provider has some sort of failure, some sort of interruption, that's okay. I still have my application running on-prem or over in Google Cloud or in AWS or in a different Azure region. It really doesn't matter where it lives. But if I'm following that SRE model, which we've seen now, everything is pointing to where that's where organizations are going, I need some way to take all of those instances of my service, my application, my API, whatever it may be, and make it available to my end user or my client in a very unified and simplistic way, right? How do I improve their end user happiness? So it's important to look at, well, is my application web-based or is it not? Well, if it's not, right, typically we're going to look at either Azure's load balancer offering, or if it is internet facing but not in a layer 7 HTTP or HTTPS nature, I may look at something like Azure Traffic Manager. However, if it is a web-based application, right, and Then we ask ourselves, okay, do we use something like an Azure Application Gateway, or do we use our Azure Front Door? And really it boils down to, is this a regional-based deployment, which is kind of great for some smaller applications, and maybe our user base or our end users are only located in one particular area, or we're not concerned with any sort of outage. But typically we are, right? And our user base ends up being a lot broader than we think. And so this is where Azure Front Door really comes in and helps shine, because it is global, it is multi-region. It can touch anything that has a public accessible endpoint. And then that's whether it's a public IP address or even a publicly addressable DNS, right? If I can recursively figure out from a DNS perspective where it is, then I can leverage Azure Front Door to reach out to that service endpoint. And one of the reasons why Front Door is preferred over Traffic Manager, and I do get this question probably quite a few, for quite a lot, surprisingly, is Traffic Manager is DNS based, and that's great, but we have that pesky time to live situation to worry about, right? And because it only works at that domain level, there is a delay. You know, even if you set the time to live down to super low, right? There's this delay that can happen from a failure perspective. So if we need to swap over to a different region or to a different instance, there's going to be some downtime. And this is where Front Door similarly doesn't have that same issue. The reason is because Front Door is a part of Microsoft's global delivery network. So imagine Microsoft's entire global delivery network and all of those little points of presence that you connect into from a content delivery network perspective. Excuse me, Azure Front Door is available in all of those. And you can go to a website on Microsoft Docs and you can see all of the cities where all those various points of presence are. And Azure Front Door has a hook in every single one of those. And so your application is cached in each one of those points of presence. So if an instance fails, say in ECUS2, for example, I have another potential instance in, say, ECUS or ECUS3 or Central US or North Central, right? Immediately available because it's cached in that application delivery network for me, right? To help accelerate my application being there. So this is really what makes Azure Front Door the preferred service from a critical application perspective. Now, a funny note, and I'm sure everybody's hand probably has go up. I'm sure everyone here uses Office 365 or Microsoft 365. Any guesses on what service actually fronts that SaaS delivery? Yep, Azure Front Door. So you've been using Front Door if you've consumed any part of Office 365 for the last decade, right? So can you think of a time when Office 365 has really truly gone down? I can't. It's been a really long time. So that's right. So the very service that we're talking about leveraging today is a very service that pretty much most of Microsoft's customers, right, have been leveraging for the better, part of a decade. And it's funny when I hear people be like, oh, well, I'm not sure about Front Door and all that stuff. And when I give them that story about Office 365, they're like, oh, right? Because it sounds new, it sounds kind of unheard of, but when you put it in the context of, hey, it's what Microsoft has been using for their own service, especially something like Office 365, it becomes, far less, I don't want to say the term cloudy, but right, it becomes more demystified. So what specifically is Azure Front Door, right? Azure Front Door is a global scalable entry point, right? And it uses all of Microsoft's, right, CDN global edge network, right, to create a very fast, secure, and widely scalable web-based application. And how they do this, again, they put everything in all those various points of presence, is through Anycast capability, right? So accelerating that application performance using that TCP-based Anycast protocol. Now, when we talk about those critical applications, part of one of the drivers is to help secure or help monitor the service health of our various microservices that make up our application. And Front Door has a very intelligent health probe for monitoring all of those backend resources, right? So as we're talking about SRE and that monitoring capability, what are the things that people think about and drive them towards making sure they have a reliable model, right? So making sure that health probe is monitoring all of your backend resources for health, for availability, to service your end users to make sure that they're happy. Just like the application gateway, it does support URL path-based routing for requests. So you can use a single front door to host multiple various web applications. You do not need to limit it to one-to-one. It's one-to-many from a hosting perspective. Now, it would behoove me not to talk about some of the improvements that have been made to Front Door. Front Door as itself has been kind of a standalone service for the last couple of years. However, Microsoft did recently release 2 new SKUs, what they call Azure Front Door Standard and Azure Front Door Premium. And essentially what these new additions have done is combine Front Door with the web application firewall, which it did technically have in the past, but it added now this new component of the Azure Content Delivery Network. And the reason being is we've seen a lot of microservice applications, API-based applications, right, being more used to deliver content, to deliver video, to deliver audio, to deliver images, to deliver something, right, documents, you name it. And Front Door initially wasn't really optimized for this type of application workload. While it did sit on the same network as CDN, it didn't actually leverage some of the capabilities that CDN offered it. So the team really went to work and to figure out how to bring those services together, and the result is these 2 new SKUs. Now, the standard SKU, again, content delivery optimized, whether it's either static content or dynamic, right? Doesn't matter. You still get that global load balancing. You still get your SSL offloading, the domain and certificate management capability. You also get enhanced traffic analytics, right? So as I'm looking at monitoring my application, right, the alerting capabilities, I need that traffic analytics to help tell me what's going on, how much traffic is funneling to a certain URL path, or maybe this URL path, or how many users are staying on this particular static content versus maybe going over to this other static content over here. So I get all of those enhanced traffic analytic capabilities. And then it includes those basic security capabilities that the Azure WAF will offer you. Now, on top of that, the premium SKU adds in some additional capabilities, right? So we now have enhanced WAF capabilities. So there are additional services and things that you can do from a premium perspective with the WAF that you cannot do with the standard SKU. You also get bot protection. So we all know, love and hate those pesky little bots as in terms of bypassing some of our web stuff. So instead of doing the CAPTCHA and all those other things, the Azure Front Door Premium actually has built-in bot protection, right, to make sure we can discern who's a real user versus who is a bot user. My favorite feature from a premium perspective is the private link support, right? So if I want my origin to be from a private link perspective, have all of my services not be public facing, right? We talked about earlier how Front Door can hit any public facing, whether it be IP or DNS base, right? Well, Premium can hit anything as long as it has that private link capability. So even if my service is on-prem or in some other cloud and it's a private IP address, well, Front Door Premium can't get to it so long as there is a private link connection to that service into my Azure environment where my Azure Front Door Premium is being hosted. And then there's also some integrations with Microsoft Threat Intelligence and Security Analytics, again, enhancing that security capability to make sure that we are securing our API or our web application or our static website or whatever it may be with the most up-to-date threat intelligence and security capabilities that Microsoft has to offer. So to create our fantastic front door, I'm not going to walk you through a Terraform or a Bicep code, unfortunately. But if you do want to try that out, I can make some recommendations on where to get started with those. But from a traditional standpoint, we'll just talk about how you set this up in the portal, and then we'll jump into a demo that I have set up to explore the front door. Now, pretty straightforward. We just need to go up and type in front door to go ahead and add our front door host. Obviously, this does need to be a globally unique host name because it is a global service. And it comes with that nice, lovely azurefd.net URL that obviously no one will keep. You'll change it to some custom domain for you. But because of that reason, it does need to have a global unique name. We'll go ahead and add a backend pool. Again, a backend pool can be whatever we want it to be, as long as it is accessible from the front door service, right? If it's the traditional front door service, it has to be public facing or front door standard. So fully qualified domain name, public IP, located anywhere, doesn't even have to be in Azure. If it's front door premium, right? As long as it's connected to the private link service, we can access it via private IP. It doesn't have to be public IP. So once we add the backend pool, we'll then create the routing rule that will map front door to your backend pool. Now, when we configure our routing rules, this will look eerily familiar for those of you who have set up Azure Application Gateway. What's a little bit different is the routing rules within front door are composed of two major parts, what they refer to as the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So the front door, what it does at first is matches the incomer request to the left-hand side of the route. So think HTTPS www.microsoft.com, right? And then on the right-hand side, right, I'm looking for how to process that request, right? So left hand, I need to match what's coming in, right? So what's the protocol, HTTP or HTTPS? What's the host, right? www.microsoft.com or star.microsoft.com or whatever. And then what is that path, right? So /docs/ you name it, right? And then right-hand side, we're doing how to process that request, whether caching is enabled or not, or where we route it from a specific perspective, or do we redirect it to some other location? So those two marry up together from a routing perspective. Now, in configuring our backend targets, again, we can choose the type of backend host that we have. There are some that do auto-populate for us. So if we are connected to something like an app service or a VM that's hosted in Azure, those are much easier to obviously set up. That shouldn't go without saying if you're hosting it in Azure, but we still can connect to other things. But if you'll notice from our window here, we select the type that we're looking for. If it's something hosted in Azure, you're going to pick the Azure subscription that it's in, and then it'll hopefully auto-populate that backend host name for you. If it's something that's not hosted in Azure, you'll have to specify that backend host name as well as what that host header is going to look at, and then you'll define what its HTTP and HTTPS ports are, and then you'll assign a priority and a weight to that backend target. Now, we talked about the front door service having a fairly robust health probe service, and it absolutely does, right? So we can use health probes in two different methods. We can either use the get method, meaning we can retrieve what information in the form that we request via the request URI. So we can request information about our application. So if our application has the configuration based on certain telemetry from a health perspective, right, we can use a get method to go ahead and retrieve all of that data and source it in the Azure Front Door blade. And then we can also use the head method, which is it's very similar to get, but the server cannot return a message body in the response, right? So almost identical, but slightly different. Typically, I will recommend that you use the head method because most applications tend not to have a message body in the response anyways. But if you have an older application and you haven't quite refactored it to a certain extent, the get method will be preferable for some of those legacy web-based applications. But otherwise, most refactored or modern applications are going to use the head method. And so that's the one that's set up by default. Now, our front door does have SSL offloading or end-to-end SSL encryption capabilities as well. So we can add in, yes?
Yeah, before we get too far afield, there's a question from Irene. She's wondering if you could explain more about what are the priority and weight values. Oh, I think they were on the couple slides ago.
Got it. Right up here. Priority and weight. Okay. So priority has to deal with from a host selection, right? So if I am routing to a backend target, right, and I have obviously multiple instances of my application located whatever, setting a priority value and setting a weight value helps determine the intelligence of how a end user or a client is routed to a particular application. So Azure Front Door, like Traffic Manager, has various routing methods, and you can select either priority, you can select weight, or you can select by geo. So that's where the priority and weight value comes in. So as you're adding your backend pool, you assign a priority, right? Do I deem this particular service to be priority number 1, and then this next one's going to be priority 2, priority 3. So it's to help feed into Front Door from a routing intelligence perspective. Hey, which one is kind of the first one that I want from our priority perspective, and which one's number 2, number 3, right? And so on and so forth. So as it's routing users and determining who should go where, right? If I select a priority-based routing method, the priority value. Same thing with weight, right? So depending on the weight that you assign, right? So 50% weight will go to this application, 60, 70, right? So depending on the weight that you assign to each backend host, that'll determine from a routing perspective where Front Door will send your clients or end users. So that's ultimately where, when you see this configuring your backend target, those values come in. It's purely from a routing intelligence perspective. Does that answer your question there, Irene? Yeah, perfect. Yeah, a lot of similarities between Traffic Manager and Front Door, at least from a routing perspective. So if you're familiar with how Traffic Manager, you create the Traffic Manager profiles and determine how to route your DNS-based traffic, right? You have the different profile methods you can select. Front Door, almost identical to that. The only difference is it has path-based capabilities, where Traffic Manager is a little bit more less specific. It's at the domain level. All right. So SSL and end-to-end SSL encryption capabilities. Again, we can create either HTTP or HTTP to HTTPS redirect rules, much like we could with our application gateways. So if we do obviously want none of our users going to HTTP, we'll redirect them to our HTTPS. We'll create a specific handle for that HTTPS traffic, and then we can either offload that SSL traffic on our front door service, much like we can with our application gateway, right? But we can do it at a global scale, and obviously front door auto scales automatically in the backend. It's nothing that you have to worry about from a scale unit perspective. The front door service handles all of that for you. A little more manual with the application gateway from a regional perspective, but with front door, because of its global scale capabilities, you don't have to worry about all of the various scale units, both in region and from a global perspective. Or you can do end-to-end SSL if you want to make sure that the encryption goes all the way through to your application. All right, demo time. I've set up a nice little demo environment for us to take a look at. So first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up here. I'm going to walk through, door. So you'll notice I do have one created already. The reason being is it'll take a little bit of time to set one up. So we'll just walk through how to create one, and then we'll go into the one that's already built here. So a little bit different. You can select different options, right? So you have the classic offerings, right? So the class, they now refer to the original front door as classic. Same thing with CDN. So you'll see that you have CDN standard, classic, and the other third-party offerings from Verizon and Akamai. Or you have the newer ones, which is the standard and the premium. You can either do a quick create or you can do custom. So depending on your level of skill and setting things up from a front door perspective, you can either get started with a very simplified deployment and take essentially all of the default settings, or if you need to heavily customize, specify different domains, various origin groups, right, and define all the different routes to connect to them and the various WAF policies to assign to each one of those, you'll do a custom create option from there. We're going to take the quick create option. So you're going to pick your resource group. Name, again, needs to be something that is globally unique to the environment. So we'll call this front door 001. Again, tier, we have our standard, we have our premium. You'll notice when I do select premium, private link comes up as an option. Right, and you can see all the different origin types, right? So I can pick storage accounts, different cloud service, app service, static web app, right? API, app gateway, public IP. I can even select a traffic manager. Spring Cloud is now in there, containers, or I can even select custom, right? I can define the host name as, something I host from a public DNS perspective. I have app services, right? So I can pick, and then if I want to ensure that that connection is not public, right? So from front door to my origin, right? If I want it to be a private link service, I can go ahead and select that option. And then I need to specify those methods. I'm not going to enable private link for now. So we're going to call my endpoint name. Right, so you see my nice little endpoint host names getting updated here to something incredibly ugly. But caching, absolutely do want to enable that again. Right, we want to cache our static content in the application delivery network, right? So for fast failures, so I can choose different query caching behaviors, right? So I can either ignore the query string or I can use it. I can use ignore specified ones or I can include specified ones. I can enable compression if I need to. WAF policies, right? So if I've got a WAF policy that I want to set up, I can create a WAF policy. And maybe I don't want bots in there, right? So I can go ahead and create that. So create my customized WAF policy. And that's it. Now, if I were to hit review and create and actually create, it does obviously take a little bit of time to set that up. So we're not going to hit to that button because lo and behold, I have one already available to us. So welcome to our Azure Front Door. Now you'll see two different setting options here. I have my front door designer, and then I have the various web application firewall policies that are associated with my front door front ends, right? Or multiple front ends, depending on how many you are hosting. In my demo environment, I just have one at the moment, but if I were to add additional front ends, right, I can add additional WAF policies per front end, right? Depending, maybe I have one web application that needs certain rule sets where maybe another one needs a different setup. The front door designer, this should look eerily familiar if any of you have touched Azure Logic Apps. So kind of similar design, right? I have my various front ends or domains that are tied to backend pools and then tied into my routing rules. So if I want to go ahead and add a new custom, right, host name, I can. I can add that in here. And I can enable that. I can specify my TLS version. Just if you change it off 1.2, shame on you. Do that. You can specify whether or not you want front door to manage that certificate for you, or you can use your own. And it'll tell you specifically how to do that. So you will need a service principal within Azure Active Directory, and then the front door service is going to need permission into a Azure Key Vault. So yes, that own certificate needs to be hosted inside of Azure Key Vault, and then you'll have to grant front door permission to those secrets inside of your Key Vault via the policy service. I know that there is a new RBAC model within Azure Key Vault for setting up permissions. Front door doesn't currently love that right now, but I know it's something they're working on fixing. So you're gonna have to use the access policy method and making sure that this Microsoft.azure.frontdoor service principal has the get secret permission. Web Application Firewall, again, you can enable that. You can set up a policy. And if you want session affinity, right? So making sure that user sessions are mapped to the same application backend, right? So we can enable that, or we can disable that from a custom perspective. Backend pools, again, we can choose our type: app service, cloud service, storage, right? App gateway, just a public IP address, right? Traffic manager or some custom host. As long as I know that IP or fully qualified domain name, I can reach it. So again, it doesn't have to be hosted here in Azure. I can literally host it wherever I want. There's just a more simplistic setup if something is in Azure versus somewhere else, but still very capable to host that service irregardless. Michael, I would love TLS 1.3 also. I have not heard anything about when they're going to add that in there, but I'm sure it's in the backlog to be added. So that is the front door designer. Web application firewall, again, I do have this enabled on here. So you can see I've got my policy set up for this environment. I can remove the policy or I can apply it. Right, so you can see right there, I can hit add. So if I set up a front end and I didn't initially apply a WAF policy, but I want to come back and do it later, I absolutely can do that. I can just go in here. I'll select my new front end, hit apply policy. I'll select the policy that I want it for it to apply to, and then go ahead and hit save. So again, each front end can have a different policy. You do not have to apply a uniform policy to all of your various front ends. So a lot of granularity from the security perspective. Rule engine. Again, I can customize how I want my front door to process. So I can just call this test 1 and call this rule name and demo. Right, so I can specify how I want the front door to process certain things. So if I want to look for a specific request header, a header name has, let's just say Microsoft. Right. And contains change that to Boston. Right, I can do lowercase, I can do uppercase, right? So I can specify any number of different rules, all right? So all of these rules are if then statements. And delete that. And we'll discard our little rule here, but as you can see, I can specify, yes, that's fine. But I can customize how any specific HTTP requests are handled at the edge, right? So it gives me more control over how I'm routing various things to my application or applications, depending on what I'm hosting from a front door perspective. Now, alerting. Oops, that's not what I wanted. I wanted metrics, right? So I have all my nice little standard metric rules. Now, the fun thing is I can now send all of my front door data into my log analytics workspace, which I do have one configured. So if you go down here and I'm looking for my traffic analytics. Oh. There it is, insights. So I don't currently have, not really anybody's hitting my front end, so I don't really have a ton of data to show you from this perspective. See if any logs really have been generated out of the environment. But in a more functional environment, or at least a more active environment, you'll see a lot more data from a traffic analytics perspective being sourced into your log analytics workspace. But you'll see that all of that is being sent directly in here. But we can take a look at a number of different things. We can see how many requests per hour, right? What the firewall is seeing in terms of host, the path that it's taking, what rule, what action it was given. We can see all the request errors by host and by path, or maybe by user, right? So maybe a particular user is having issues with our application, right? So we can go in and take a look at request errors by that user agent, or maybe something is getting blocked. So we have a lot of different alerting options available to us within the front door service. But as you'll notice, all of my traffic is fairly uneventful at the moment. But hey, my health probes are 100%. I'm totally available. So that is all of our fun demo inside of the Azure environment. Alrighty. So that wraps it up for Azure Front Door and securing your critical applications as you start to expand your resiliency practices within your business or your client customers' businesses. So I will open it up for any questions that you may have.
Thanks, Derek. There is one text comment from Michael Meyer who just says, I want TLS 1.3.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah, I would love TLS 1.3 as well. I know it's been a requested feature of the product team. So I would bet a lot of money that it's in their backlog to add TLS 1.3. I don't unfortunately have any answers on when it is coming, but I assure you it's definitely something that they are working on.
It's fine if folks have a question, if you want to go off mute, feel free to do so and pose your question verbally. I have a question while we're waiting, Derek.
Go ahead.
What have you seen, or do you have any sense or visibility into the uptick in the customer market for Azure Front Door? So you mentioned that Office has been using it for quite a while. In the way you described it, it sounded like they had built out the infrastructure for Office, and they said, well, this is a solution that lots of customers could use, so they productized it. Do you know how well it's doing?
It surprisingly enough, it's probably, at least it was a fairly little used service, I think, initially. And I think a lot of that had to do with A, the pricing around it, and B, its lack of content awareness and content delivery capabilities. I think as organizations scaled out certain applications, right? And I talk about, I'm going to use Netflix as kind of like the ivory tower that we stand on from a resiliency perspective, right? As more and more people went towards that direction, right? That's kind of where classic Front Door struggled from a service perspective. So I think that's what we saw in response to that. There was a lot of user feedback, partner feedback to the Front Door team being like, hey, we really need this capability, because that's essentially a lot of the objections they were getting is, if I wanted to put Front Door in front of my application, right, how am I delivering that static content, that dynamic content, and making sure that Front Door services that in a meaningful fashion? And that's something that Office never really, I think, truly exposed as part of the service, right? Because a lot of the content that it's surfacing is email and things of that nature, so it wasn't very dynamic in nature. I don't think a ton of people were using Office 365 for image delivery or video delivery or constant
Right.
constant changing from that perspective. So I think in response to that, right, that's where now we see the new standard and premium SKUs, and we've certainly started seeing more people recognize from a resiliency perspective, hey, we need to put something in front of this. So I've seen a lot of Fortune, we'll say 100 clients start to adopt Front Door in front of major applications that I would say everybody in this audience today, if you have a mobile phone, you're probably using some of these apps. They're actually being fronted by Front Door today. I can think of an active engagement that my company is working on now. I can't name the client, obviously, But that's one of the things we're working on is their critical mobile application. And it's now being fronted by Front Door because it's obviously deployed globally from their perspective. So yeah, a lot of, I'm hoping that, as we've hit the 100 level, right, then we'll start trickling down into 500 and, and lower and lower. So I think pricing wise, it's gotten better now with the standard and premium SKU differentiation. And I think the addition of CDN has really helped pacify a lot of the original objections to people onboarding Front Door. So definitely, yeah, I think the trajectory, as I think hopefully my slides have highlighted, right, it's just going to go up, right, along with the SRE adoption.
Yeah, thanks. That's really interesting. You were talking about, well, Microsoft has been historically, they've been really good at listening to customers and adopting based on real usage patterns, and that sounds like what you're describing there. And over COVID, of course, the use of Teams increased, pretty substantially. I don't know what the numbers are. Maybe it went up. It must have gone up some full multiple. Didn't go up 10%. Yeah, it went way up. So I'm guessing based on your description that really exercised Azure Front Door quite a bit and took advantage of it. You were saying, image delivery, that's an example.
Yeah, I mean, so originally, right, I think even though Skype for Business, and I'm sure people are groaning, right, Skype for Business was a, I don't want to say 50-50 adoption rate, right? Either people did adopt it and they kind of liked it, or they didn't. And I know the original people brought over from Skype were never really big fans of Skype for Business. And so that's kind of, yeah. So when Teams kind of came around, right, there was this, big energy, like, oh yay, like we've kind of rectified, the earlier stepchild. And so I think based on its current use and how classic Front Door was designed, there was really no issue. And then, like you said, COVID hit, and all of a sudden, this absolutely monumental spike in this data happened. And classic Front Door was just no longer a sufficient solution. And it's not, without that event, I don't think, Microsoft may have eventually realized that issue. I just don't think they would have realized it as soon as it did. So I think literally almost 12 months to the day later is when standard and premium were announced, right after COVID hit. I think they announced it in February of 2021. Sometimes not working great together. Yeah, it's not perfect. But yeah, that's when those new SKUs were announced, and they really took into account like, hey, we need to optimize, image delivery, video content delivery, all of the dynamic capabilities that, right, the TikToks of the world, the Instagram stories, the Facebook video, right, you name it, WhatsApp, right, we can go on and on all the different very popular app services that leverage some type of dynamic facing content capability. And so that's really where the new Front Door was targeted around. So yeah, definitely, I think, COVID was kind of the biggest customer that sprang into Microsoft's lap to address that change. So.
And Derek, you very conveniently did include a slide that shows the uptick in Teams usage because of COVID. It's on your questions slide there.
Oh, yeah.
Like, to the moon.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, let me see. There were no written questions. And if you're anybody wants to come off mute, please do so now. Okay. So thank you, Derek. This was excellent. Always informative. Very, very nice to have you. Everybody can find this. Usually we have it, Jason usually posts it the next day on YouTube. So you should be able to find it at youtube.com/Boston Azure. And like I said, it should be within 24 hours, let's say that usually. And we have a couple of other talks in the queue, but we haven't officially published anything. So watch the usual places for updates. Once again, thanks, Derek Smith, and thanks everybody for joining. And we'll see you all next time. Stay safe out there.
Thanks for having me, everybody. Take care.